I would like to introduce a concept today that I believe has the potential to change the world for children. That concept is nonviolent parenting. Bullying, school shootings, a 54% increase in the number of suicides that 11 and 12-year-olds have committed, and an even higher rate of those attempting. Adults will often ask, what's wrong with kids these days? But remember, the way we talk to children will become their inner voice. Children interact with the world based on how they see themselves fitting into that world. So maybe the real question adults need to ask is, what are we doing to damage the inner voice of children? I want to share a story with you about a young girl who grew up in fear. She was constantly yelled at, belittled, called names, and spanked. She was extremely quiet and didn't have many friends, but she did well in school, listened to her teachers, so nobody paid much attention. After all, children were to be seen and not heard anyway. As she got older, the spanking stopped, but the constant belittling and name-calling continued. She started using her shyness as a protection from the real world because the adults would also tell her that nobody is ever going to really love you. They will use you for what they want, and then they will leave. I have worked in the field of early education for over 20 years with school districts as well as state and federal grants. And in that time, what I have found is that many parents are oblivious to the amount of violence their children are subjected to every day. Now, if we only look at what the media shows us about violence against children, none of us would use that label for ourselves. So before we can change, we have to first understand the definition of violence. And violence is any forceful and intentional action that will cause harm or damage. So if we think back to how we were parented and some of those tactics used on us that we know harmed us and hurt us, and that we continue to use as parents on our children, we can start to think about the 5 most common elements of violent parenting. The first one is hitting. Now, this is the one that I usually get the most pushback on because we like to downplay it and say, I just popped them really quick, I just smacked them, they had to learn, but we are hitting them. And if we look at the instance of domestic violence in our community, we can trace it back to those first experiences of the person who loves them the most hitting them out of the name of love. And so fast forward 15, 20 years later, and this child is now in a relationship with somebody who hits them, and we ask the question, why don't they just leave? Well, because when they were 3 years old, when they were 5 years old, the person hit them out of love. And so they learned that being hit every now and then is associated with someone who really loves you. The second point is screaming and yelling. This happens typically out of frustration, but when we get upset, a lot of times we can't regulate ourselves, and so then we go into the next one, which is name calling. The fourth one is punitive punishment. Now, punitive punishment are those things such as grounding children, taking away privileges, not allowing them to play with their friends, basically anything that'll make their life less enjoyable in the name of teaching them a lesson. The last one is instilling fear. This one is also big in our community because we have associated fear with respect. And so if a child doesn't fear an adult, we feel like they don't respect an adult, and that's not true. Other ways we instill fear are things like the belt. So how many of us are fearful of the belt? Or, you know, if you see your mom pull out the chancla or the spoon, you're about to get it. The other one is the look. Parents have a way of looking at children where they know you better act right or else. All of these things are forms of fear and violence in children. Carl Rogers was a theorist who studied how children develop their self-worth. And self-worth is the value we place on ourselves, also known as self-esteem. Carl Rogers said that for a person to have optimal development of their self-worth, they need to have 3 things: genuineness, acceptance, and empathy. The first one is genuineness. Genuineness is being deeply interested and authentic with your child. But what exactly does deeply interested mean? Well, for starters, when children talk, We must listen every single time. It doesn't matter how many times we've heard the story. It doesn't matter how tired we must be. When they talk, we must listen. How many people in here have or know a child who talks a lot? Yes, I do too. I have one. My daughter started talking at a very young age, and she hasn't stopped. She's now 10 years old. But when I think about it, part of the reason why she continues to talk is because the adults in her life have always showed a deep interest in her stories. So other ways we can show deep interest is knowing the names of your friends, of the friends of your kids, knowing events that are going on in their lives, and asking questions just to simply know, not to get information. Knowing what their interests are and when they change. My son is 12 years old and he plays baseball, and over the past few years, I've become a little bit of an expert in baseball, at least I think so. I can now tell you the names of teams, of players, who's on the injury list, baseball terminology, anything and everything you need to know. And it's not because I grew up with the love of baseball, it's because I know he loves baseball, and I want him to know that I am deeply interested in his interests. The second one is acceptance. Acceptance is loving children unconditionally. Children come into this world with their own thoughts and opinions. Now, the interesting thing about parenting is that it flips you upside down, and most of the time, your child's thoughts and opinions are completely different than your own. So what do you do when your child comes downstairs with her pearls on and her tutu, and she's ready to master the first day of kindergarten? Well, in this instance, we have two options. We can yell at her and tell her to go back upstairs and choose an appropriate outfit for school and then continue to yell because now we're late. Or we can take a step back, give her a little compliment because look at that fashion sense, and accept that her individuality is now coming forward. The third one is empathy. And empathy can be one of the most challenging things for parents to give to children. Not because they don't want to connect with them, but because they really have forgotten what it's like to be a toddler. We forget what it's like to be frustrated and awkward as a teenager. And so how can we give empathy to children? Well, if you look at this picture, my daughter, she was upset because kids get upset. She wasn't able to tell me why she was upset, but she decided to go under the table, cry, and when I went to check on her, she eventually had fallen asleep, so I left her. Now, although I never understood why she was upset, the ways in which I was able to show empathy was allowing her the space to not have to tell me what was wrong, because I understood that sometimes I don't want to talk either, or I can't articulate it. Another way in which I was able to show empathy was allowing her to sleep, because let's be honest, sometimes we just want to get away and sleep as well. So I want to take you back to the girl who grew up with fear and punishment. When she got into high school, she started playing sports and came into contact with some amazing coaches who were able to practice genuineness, acceptance, and empathy with her. These interactions started to build up her self-confidence and her self-worth, and she started becoming more outgoing and trying new things. She went on to graduate college and continued to do some amazing things because this once shy person had now came out of her shell. One of the things she was able to do is tell her story about why violence must be removed in the lives of children on the stage of TEDxCrenshaw. So what are some things we can do today to ensure we remove violence from the lives of children and treat them better? The first one is to practice genuineness and be deeply interested in our children. The second one is acceptance. Our children don't have to be little mini-me's. They're their own person. And the third one is to have empathy. My story is proof that you can start doing this with children at any age. The goal is to change their inner voice so that they can go out into the world and make a positive impact. If we want peace in the world, we have to start with children. Thank you.